Right. So, if anyone has missed the previous classes in this series, they're on our YouTube channel, which is accessible at tnlsf.org. There have been two prior classes on the 4th and the 11th. And so we are up to chapter 5 in His Holiness's book. My thought is to try maybe to get through chapter 7 at most tonight. I don't know if that will go quickly or if that will go slowly, but I'm aiming not to go past chapter 7 tonight. So, like I said, we'll start with chapter 5, which is called Appreciating the Reasoning of Dependent Arising. So we looked in the previous chapters at the wisdom realizing emptiness, which is the particular essence of the wisdom that this book is predominantly focused on, which when we say emptiness or voidness, we mean that everything that we as a sentient being cognize, and this is true of any sentient being, we're one kind of sentient being, and so for us, that's the most relevant right now, is how we specifically cognize, but it's applicable to any sentient being's cognition, that when a sentient being engages in a cognition of an object of knowledge, then there's a mistake that happens, kind of by definition, that if a person or a sentient being is ordinary, meaning has not had a direct, non-conceptual insight, meditative insight into this topic, then necessarily all cognitions arise with the mistaken view of what's called inherent existence. And inherent existence layers on top of what is cognized and perceives a solidity, like a broadcasting of an essence from what is being cognized to our subjective mind, and that solidity, that concretization, that essence is an elaboration that the mind is adding on top of what's there. And so when we say empty or void, because voidness is another translation of shunyata, which is the word that's also translated into English as emptiness. And voidness I like maybe a little bit better, because voidness, because a void is a mere absence. You know, if you have a cup, a heavy object, and you pour water around it, and then you remove the heavy object, there will be a void. You'll have a pattern of wetness, and then you'll have a void. So you have a mere absence of something. There's a void. Whereas emptiness kind of implies a thing that is empty of, like it implies the vessel or the container, which isn't necessarily wrong, because the emptiness of an object does depend on its object. The emptiness of a cup is different than the emptiness of a computer. You can only talk about the emptiness of the object itself. But it kind of, if in the beginning, I feel like it almost does a little bit of concretizing in the word. So I kind of like the idea of voidness. But anyway, you can kind of just play around and see what your thought is about that in your own exploration of the topic. Hello, welcome. So, yeah, So when we say empty or void, what we mean is empty or void of inherent existence, that things that we cognize don't appear, don't exist in the way that they appear. They appear to the mind with that sense of solidity, with that sense of concreteness, but that is what they don't actually possess. It is a mental fabrication that is not present in the object, whereas to us it is present in the object. And that's what this mistaken perspective, this is what we're arguing against when the wisdom realizing emptiness is what we're trying to cultivate. We're trying to cultivate a way of arguing against this mistaken perception. So, His Holiness, in the previous chapter, introduced the way of analyzing that which we cognize to demonstrate its emptiness of inherent existence. So he gave us three. So that is to in because that inherent existence is like an independent arising, meaning that it is as if the object, because it arises with what seems like an essence, what seems like a findable identity, it is as if it is an independent arising, meaning that it does not depend on anything. It just is just sort of there. Like when we go into a room and there's a chair, there is just a chair in the room, and it is as if to the mind there's always been a chair in that room, and there will always be a chair in that room, and that chair has always been a chair and will always be a chair, because the object that we're cognizing, it is as if to the unanalyzed mind that it has a nature, it has a essence that we're passively noticing because it has the power to broadcast that essence to our mind. And that unanalyzed way of perceiving is problematic. And that's what we're trying to see through. And we see through it by not just accepting the world of appearances, but by taking time to actually analyze whether or not that view is correct. We start with the hypothesis that it's not correct, and we prove that by demonstrating that it is actually a dependent arising, that it that there is a phenomenon that we're cognizing, but it depends on three things. It depends on causes and conditions, it depends on parts, and it depends on conceptuality. It depends on an act of mental imputation or mental labeling. Um, so if we stop and apply those three analyses to the object, then we can correctly identify that the object is a dependent arising. It does arise, but it arises only in dependence upon its causes and conditions, its parts, and then an active act from our side of mental imputation or mental labeling. Uh, so, Chapter 5 is about appreciating, as I said, it's called Appreciating the Reasoning of Dependent Arising. But should I pause here before we move on? Is there a question? This, as I mentioned, these previous two classes were recording. For this is a pretty dense book, so it's difficult to miss classes and for it to make sense. It's a difficult book. Um, Should I, any questions, thoughts? Okay, so he starts then by looking at this idea of parts, which is one of these three spheres of reasoning. Um, he says the parts and the whole depend on each other, but they seem to have their own entities. If the whole and its parts existed the way they appear to you, you should be able to point out a whole that is separate from its parts, but you cannot. So that's that's getting at what we mean when we demonstrate that something is empty of inherent existence. What we are demonstrating is that under analysis, something that seems like it ought to be findable is ultimately not findable. That, going back to this idea of an essence or a nature, like the chairness of a chair or the tableness of a chair, here what His Holiness is pointing out is that that label, that concept that we ascribe to, whether it's a clock or a floor or a door or a table or a cup, um, those are all labels, and they, to the mind, to the subjective mind, the label of cup or table or door appears to have the power to own its parts. That's one of the ways that the falsity of appearance gives rise to this essence. Because when we look at a door, we say, oh, it's a brown door. Um, um, or it's a tall door, or it's a wooden door. Um, so there was a, yeah. So if we look at all of the characteristics of a door, we can, we can touch it. If we wanted to, we could taste it. We could be like, oh, it's a, if it's a wooden door, it's going to taste like that. If it's a metal door, it's going to have a metallic taste. So we can, we could interrogate it through any of our senses. We could smell it. We could be like, oh, the door smells like sandalwood, or it smells like oak, um, what have you, or it's shiny or it's dull. So we have all of these sense impressions of this isolated object, and we have this idea that all of these different characteristics, however many there might be, that they are all simultaneously owned by the concept of door, that the door possesses brownness, and it possesses woodenness, and it possesses, um, you know, whatever, a pleasant smell or an unpleasant smell. And so that, in that sense, he says a table depends on its existence, for its existence, on its parts. So it's what we call the collection of its parts, the basis upon which it is set up. When we search analytically to try to find this table that appears to our minds as if it exists independently, we must look for it within the basis, the legs, the top, and so forth. But nothing from within the parts is such a table. Thus, these things are not a table, become a table in dependence upon thought. A table does not exist in its own right. Um, he says, from this viewpoint, a table is something that arises or exists dependently It depends on certain causes, it depends on its parts, and it depends upon thought. These are the three modes of dependent arising. Of these, one of the more important factors is the thought that designates an object. So that's, he says that's the subtlest way of understanding dependent arising is mere that which is merely designated. Has my sound? Oh yeah, okay. I don't know. So that which is merely designated. So when we say that, because when we say that when we say that the table is, you know, exists in dependence upon causes and conditions, then we're like, yeah, okay, well, you had to chop down the tree or you had to melt the iron and you had to shape it and so on. So yeah, there's causes and conditions. And then you can say, well, yes, it has a top, yes, it has a bottom, yes, it has sides, it has a front and a back and a color. So it has parts. But the subtlest way of thinking about it is that it's merely imputed by the mind. It's merely designated by the mind. Um, so because the other things, they they have a materiality to them, the causes and conditions, the parts, they, they have a separate, those are things that exist out in the world. So it doesn't get at dependent arising in the subtlest way because they still are referring to the material aspects of it. But when we recognize that primarily what's happening is that I am merely designating that collection of parts to be a table or to be a chair or to be a door. And that mere designation is really how it exists conventionally. It exists merely in dependence upon my thought that it is a table, that it is a chair, that it is a door. If I had a different cultural view or a different history or a different upbringing, I would designate it differently. It would appear similar to something else that I have in my culture, and I would think, oh, that's not a, you don't sit on that. You actually use that to do this other thing. And so I would merely designate it in that way. You could show someone a tennis ball from, maybe an indigenous tribe, and for us, as soon as we look at a tennis ball, we're like, oh, that's a tennis ball. You use that to play tennis. Maybe you could think, oh, well, you might also bounce it against the wall and catch it, but we wouldn't think, but a person in the indigenous tribe, they might think, oh, that would be really handy, maybe for like knocking, um, a small mammal out of a tree to be able to capture it or to eat it or something. Maybe because maybe they have a tool that's similar in their culture based on what they do and what their life is like and what their society is like and what their level of technology is like. Um, so they wouldn't think, oh, that's what you hit over a net with a racket to score points. And they might think, oh, that's similar to this thing that we have in our culture that we use in this way. Uh, and the object didn't change. Its causes and conditions didn't change. Its parts haven't changed. But what is merely designated by mind has changed. So that's why of the three, it's the most powerful of those three, because the first two, again, they refer to the material aspects of the object. But what really trumps those is how any given sentient being designates or imputes the object from their own side. So then, of course, we've touched on this before, but he gets into an important point about how we have to be really careful not to give rise to a nihilistic view. Because in the next subsection, he says emptiness does not mean nothingness. He says there's no question that persons and things exist. The question is how or in what manner they exist. He says, when we consider a flower, we think this flower has a nice shape, nice color, nice texture. It seems as if there is something concrete that possesses these qualities of shape, color, and texture. When we look into these qualities as well as the parts of the flower, they seem to be qualities or parts of the flower, such as the color of the flower and so on. Um, as if there is a flower that possesses these qualities or parts. However, if the flower really existed the way it appeared, we should be able to come up with something separate from all of these qualities or parts that is the flower, but we cannot. Such a flower is not found upon analysis. So that's really the essence of what's meant by emptiness. What is not findable under analysis. When we engage in understanding that, it does seem like that to me. It does seem like the color of the flower belongs to the flower. The petal, there's 6 or 8 petals of the flower. The flower has 8 petals, or the spider has 8 legs, or my friend has 2 arms. It seems like whatever label we are bringing to mind, there is an owner of all of the different parts to it. And all we're trying to determine with this analysis is whether or not that's valid. Is that a valid way of perceiving that object? And if it is a valid way of perceiving that object, then the Buddha is wrong, and this isn't a real thing. But that means that when we look for that essence, we need to be able to point to it and say, this is why I perceive in this way. This is where this essence is findable. I can point to this part, and I can say, this is why it seems to me that this concept, this label, is able to possess the qualities of the object. It has to be distinct, because if it wasn't distinct from the parts, then we wouldn't need to use a different way of talking about it. We wouldn't need to say the chair is red, because chair and red have to be different things in order for the chair to be red. And so where is the chair that is red? What is it about that object that is a chair that can possess the quality of being red? And so when we have to, of course, first recognize that things appear like that to us, and then we have to say, okay, well, if I'm cognizing validly, if I'm cognizing correctly, if there's no problem here, then when I search for that essence, I should be able to identify it. I should be able to explain to someone, where is that essence? How did I find it? And what this wisdom is pointing out is that under analysis, when we look within the object and we dissect it kind of in our imagination, in our mind, we never actually identify anything that is a findable essence in the object. And so then what we're doing is we're just negating that concrete view that was previously there. We've talked about in the previous classes how the wisdom of emptiness is a non-affirming negation. So all we're doing is recognizing that it seems like what I'm cognizing has an essence, but under analysis, there is no such essence. So we're kind of left in a groundless state. We're kind of left in I don't really know anything other than there is an appearance to the mind that's like this, but that appearance doesn't actually refer to anything findable. It doesn't refer back to anything that's truly identifiable. And that's all we have to do. Of course, it's incredibly difficult because when you look at just in the, as I said before, you look at the room and you're simultaneously concretizing hundreds of different conceptual objects. So it's kind of, the mind kind of gets overwhelmed by all of the things. And so it's so much easier to just be like clock and table and chair and floor and rug and, cup, rather than being like, oh, well, does it really exist in the way that it appears, or does it exist differently than it appears? So it isn't that we're negating the existence of things, we're just negating the the idea that there is a findable essence to things, which is how the appearance of the object seems or presents itself to the mind. We kind of assent to a concretized view of objects when they appear to the mind, but it's kind of just a cognitive shortcut that we're engaging in that's not actually valid. And as we've pointed out, the disadvantage of that is that it gives an importance to things that they don't actually have. When we think of our identity, because our identity is one cognizable object among all of the different, we can think about how we think about ourselves, how our identity presents itself, just in the same way that we can think about how a cup is presenting itself to our mind. We can think about how our own identity presents itself to our mind. And when we give a status of solidity and concreteness to the identity of I, then we get into trouble because we generally prefer things to be easy and comfortable and pleasant and enjoyable, and we prefer things not to be difficult or unpleasant, or to be other than how we would ideally just like things to go. So we give an outsized importance to pleasant objects and unpleasant objects, and that gives rise to clinging and aversion. So all of the trouble that we get into can be traced back to giving a status to our identity that's more concretized than it really deserves. He says, a flower certainly exists, but when we search to find a flower existing in accordance with our ideas about it, that is not at all findable. So it isn't that we're negating too much. We're not saying everything is just a total fabrication. There are valid bases of designation. There are things that do exist outside of the self, but they do exist, but how do they exist? They exist as dependent arisings. They exist only in dependence upon their causes and conditions, their parts, and then that active mental designation, which labels it as a cup or as a table. Any thoughts or questions?
I have a question. Yeah. So to put it bluntly, basically, my understanding is there is no self. Is that correct? Or in what sense is there a self? Because it gets to be quite disconcerting because I look out at the world and I have to then question the conventional world. It doesn't exist as I have assumed for decades that it exists. And then I have the other conflict of who am I, in this perspective. So I'll say it's very disconcerting, almost to the point of feeling like I could lose my sanity if I got too pulled off in this direction. And I mean, I know how to ground myself, etc. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. But it is uncomfortable. And I can see how people who may have the tendency to have difficulty with reality anyway would struggle. Yeah. So those are my kind of questions, thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Lama Yeshe, says that Buddhism is for healthy people. It's not for the mentally ill. It's not for people who, because yeah, I mean, there is a way of, having it feed into delusion rather than liberate from delusion. So, these teachings shouldn't be given to, just anyone who might not be able to see it in the right way. That's certainly
No, I
true.
totally understand that. But
Yeah.
my
So,
question has more to do with
right.
the rest of us who may have some idea about this. I don't think it's uncommon for people to feel disconcerted when
Mhm.
trying to address this question
Right.
of their
Yeah.
whole reality.
Right. So that was what I meant by that sense of groundlessness. That sense of, it's almost. They say it's a good sign if you think about this. They say it's a good sign if like the hair stands up on your arms, or you like you grab at your chest for like a sense of because they say that some people almost have the perception that maybe they could fall through the floor, or maybe when they really think about this. So when we think about the self, then, so we have to ask the question, conventionally speaking, what is a self? Just like when we analyze a cup, we have to say, well, conventionally, we start with conventionality. We start with the world of appearance. So we say, well, conventionally, what is a mug? It is a flat bottomed container with a handle that we use to hold beverage. Um, you know, it's not a chair, it's not a cushion, it's not a computer, because those perform different functions. A cushion isn't something that you can drink out of, but you can drink out of a mug. So a mug serves. So this is a valid basis for the mental imputation of mug, because it has a handle, it has a circumference, it can hold liquid, it serves. We in our minds, we have a definition of what a mug can do, and things that can perform that function we can label validly as mugs. We can't validly label them as airplanes or computers, because airplanes and computers have a different function, and only the things that can perform that function can serve as a valid base for that active mental designation, which is why we're not saying things don't exist at all. We're not saying that there are no phenomenon, because there has to be a valid airplane base for me to have for me to label upon airplane. There has to be a valid, base here for me to correctly label a mug. So a self is a body and mind together. A person is a body and mind together. We are a body and mind together. All humans are bodies and minds together. When a human dies, body and mind separate, and mind goes, Buddhism would assert that mind then, goes into the intermediate state and takes rebirth, and that the body decays and, becomes ash and dust and so on. So when a body and mind are together, that is a valid base for designating I. Um, that I can talk, it can eat, it can go to work, it can, um, meditate, it can write a letter, it can perform functions, it can perform all of the functions that we ascribe to human beings, to that valid base. It can't, swim in the ocean underwater for hours and hours by itself, because humans don't have gills. So it's not a fish. It can't fly in the air, so it's not a bird. But it is a human is a valid base. A human body and human mind together is a valid base for designating the I. But when we perceive our self, again, what appears to the mind is as if our identity is the owner of body and mind. Just like when we perceive a cup, we perceive it is as if the cup is the owner of its blueness and the owner of its smoothness, and the owner of its, whatever pleasing. If it pleases us, it's the owner of having pleasing qualities. If it displeases us, it's the owner of having displeasing qualities. And so that's the problem. That's where we get into trouble. Is there is a body and there is a mind, and they are connected, and they can perform functions. That's all true, and that's not a problem. But when we have the view that there is an owner of body and mind separate from body and mind, that then we've solidified what's there. We've layered on top of body and mind something that's not true about body and mind. Um, and so when we, so again, what we would do is we would search. We would say, okay, um, I I think that this is my hand. I think that, that this is my spleen. I think that these are my eyeballs. And so how is that, where does that come from? Where does that sense of ownership? Again, because if there wasn't an owner that was over and above the eyeballs and the hand and the spleen, we wouldn't need to talk about that. We would just say, there's a spleen, there's a hand, there are eyeballs. But we don't. We say, this is my hand, these are my eyeballs. I own all of my parts. I possess all of my qualities. I possess my height, I possess my gender, I possess, you know, whatever, my kindness, my intelligence, my um, procrastinative tendencies. I possess all of these attributes, these qualities. And so if there was an owner of that, then that owner should be identifiable. When we analyze, we should be able to say, this is why, this is what's findable about that owner. And so then all we do is we look in all of those parts and we say, what can I point to that is the owner of all of these attributes? And then when we, under investigation, under analysis, there is no such owner. There is a body, there is a mind, there are causes and conditions that gave rise to that body and mind, but then we impute a really solid, sense, intrinsic sense of identity upon that collection, and we give that a power and an essence that you can't find in and amongst all of the various bits of body and mind. So we're not negating everything, we're just negating the this idea that there's like a little tiny me in there that is running the show, that's like, that is the thing that's making everything work and is sort of creating a unification out of parts, when in fact there are only parts, and causes and conditions. And then on the basis of observing the causes and the conditions and the parts, we create this fiction of a stable possessor of parts and attributes. Um, yeah, but we don't negate that that when this body and mind, when we die, that the mind is a real thing that does take rebirth, and that the body is a genuine phenomena that will dissolve into constituent elements and atoms and things. Those are genuine phenomena, um, but the solidity that we ascribe to the coming together of those two phenomena is something that we are doing in the mind, and is not isn't actually findable under investigation, under analysis. Is that at all kind of in the vein of what you were?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Any other questions? So His Holiness kind of drives home that point, in chapter 6, um, where he says, in this context of dependence, help and harm arise, impermanent phenomena can function and are not just figments of the imagination, and karma and their effects is feasible. You are feasible and I am feasible. We are not just mental creations. By understanding this, you are free from what Buddhists call the extreme of nihilism, drawing the mistaken conclusion that just because a phenomena cannot be found to exist independently, it does not exist at all. So we have these two extremes. We have eternalism, which is the view of appearances, the view that things are kind of these frozen labels, that really are out there, or the view of nihilism that where we just kind of say, well, things don't exist the way that they appear, so they don't exist at all, and nothing matters, because actions. Actions do have karmic effects. There is the mind is a genuine phenomena, and when certain actions are engaged in under the power of certain motivations, there's an energy that is created in the mind, and that will ripen in the future in a certain way. So we can still use the law of cause and in the same way, when you plant a sunflower seed, you're going to get a sunflower. you're not going to get, an asparagus. You're not going to get a squash. You're going to reliably get a sunflower every time, provided that there's enough sunlight and enough moisture and temperature is in the right range. But you're not going to get anything other than that if all of the causes and conditions are supportive of the growth of that thing, because cause and effect is still reliable. It just means that it's not an intrinsically existent sunflower because it depends upon the sunlight, it depends upon the moisture, it depends upon the causes and the conditions, and then it depends upon the parts. And most importantly, it depends upon having a mental concept of sunflower that you designate upon it, which means that you're saying, oh, it's not a rose, it's not a tulip. We've just learned these artificial, arbitrary things based on, oh, it's this long, it has this color, it has this shape. So we put that in a particular cognitive box just culturally, just for the purpose of being able to talk about things and being able to navigate the world cooperatively. But that doesn't make that object what we designate it. That's just a consequence of deciding that we're going to call it that, that we're just all in agreement that that's what it is, so that we can have a way of using the world and making the world kind of function for us. But um, that doesn't actually give that kind of status to the objects. He says, using the tool of analysis, you cannot find a being that transmigrates from one lifetime to another, but this does not mean that rebirth does not in any way exist. Just despite the fact that agent, action, and object cannot withstand analysis. To stand independently, healthy and unhealthy actions leave their imprints in the mind, and these come to fruition either in this lifetime or in a future one. The fact that people and other objects are not findable under analysis means not that they do not exist, but that they do not exist by way of their own power. They exist due to other factors. In this way, being empty of being under its own power comes to mean depending on others or being a dependent arising. So again, all we're trying to do is recognize that, to me, when I look at everything, it seems to be an independent arising. It seems to not need causes or conditions, to not need parts, and to not need an active mental imputation to exist as a table or as a chair or as a door. But in fact, it must have causes and conditions and parts and an active mental designation in order for it to appear to my mind as a table, as a chair, as a door. But it doesn't mean that the thing that I'm looking at or touching, or that it's some sort of trick, that it's some sort of grand um, hallucination. The concretization, that is a hallucination in a way. That's a trick of the mind, but it doesn't negate the phenomenon itself. It just negates our perception of the phenomenon without, prior to investigating it. Any other questions? So in chapter 7, His Holiness talks about how coming to an understanding of things as dependent arisings actually demonstrates to us that seeing them as independent arisings is seeing them in an impossible way. That because again, we're trying to uproot a mistaken perception, and what Buddhism would say is that that mistaken perception is actually impossible and has always been impossible and will always be impossible. Um, because it freezes everything that we perceive, and it doesn't permit any kind of interaction with that thing and the world, or any kind of evolution of that thing into some other thing. So for example, when you look at a baby, you see an inherently existent baby, human infant, um, and if that appearance was valid, then that baby could never grow into an adult, and it could never grow into an old person, and it could never die of old age. Similarly, it could never learn how to drive a car. It could never learn multiplication or calculus or biology, because it was a baby from its own side. It was inherently set up in a self-supporting, self-sufficient way, identical to its appearance, and so it would be incapable of any kind of growth or development or change over time. It would be like this frozen thing. So in that way, we can recognize that this false perception of independent arisings is actually, it's not something that the Buddha just invented. He didn't like create. It's not like an art form, like cubism, where like there wasn't cubism and then somebody invented cubism and now there is cubism. Um, it's not like that. The Buddha didn't invent this. He just observed it, to be true. And so the wisdom realizing emptiness has always been valid and will always be valid. And because the world of appearances is impossible, it freezes things in a way that is at odds with how we understand that things in fact do actually evolve over time. Things actually do change and do morph into different things as time passes. And that would be impossible if the mere appearance of the object as being set up independently was accurate. Uh, so we're actually just, rather than negating what's something that's true, we're kind of rescuing the object from an impossible perception, of a false, impossible view that we have, that's just kind of easier. He says, in this way, the fact of emptiness means that the object must exist, but it exists differently from what you imagined. After you've gotten a sense of emptiness, it is not sufficient just to claim that phenomena must exist, but not to have a clear sense of how they exist. You need to know from the depths of your being that understanding dependent arising promotes understanding emptiness, and understanding emptiness promotes understanding dependent arising. Let's see. He says, emptiness is extremely important because if you thoroughly understand it, you can be liberated from the cycle of destructive emotions. And through not understanding it, you'll be led as if by the nose into destructive emotions that induce lifetime after lifetime of suffering in cyclic existence. Nevertheless, when you consider that the emptiness of yourself depends on yourself, or that the emptiness of a car depends on the car, that the substratum of which emptiness is a quality seems almost more important than the emptiness itself. Okay. I don't know if there's more to say about chapter 7. Is anything coming up for anybody? It would be helpful to think about.
Something that occurred to me when thinking about all that and listening to you is this whole kind of concept of rugged individualism, which has come out in the last many years, and how it's a good example of not being dependent upon others, and you don't need anybody else to exist and or anything else, and how it's such a fallacy. So just something that occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, anything that we can do to kind of soften, the idea that we're an island, that we can think about how our bodies depend upon, the kindness of so many people who have worked to provide us with food, and and but for all of the food that we've eaten and all of the water that we've been able to have access to, our body wouldn't be able to be sustained. And that all of those things are helpful in recognizing, again, the interdependence of body and mind, and how um, we can think about it's strange how we kind of it's a this the fiction of the intrinsic self kind of follows at the same time the development of the self. So when we were 5 years old, we had a view of the intrinsic, findable self that was related to our 5-year-old self, which didn't know any of the things that we know now, can't do any of the things that we can do now, didn't have the values and the perspective. But this false sense, it kind of papers on top of every moment as we change. And so what we can recognize, what we can go back and we can think, well, but I used to play with trains and dolls and toys, and now I don't do those things anymore, and I now I understand these complicated philosophical things that I didn't understand, and I have a sense of so we can see that we ourselves have changed incredibly over the past you know 30, 40, 50, 60 years. But at every moment of that process, it was as if for that day, that moment, we were kind of frozen in that way. And then there was a subtle change and another subtle change and another, and we just kind of kept freezing those moments. And then, but then over these long periods of time, we can see these incredible changes, which kind of demonstrates. And when a person becomes 90, or and they lose their, they start to lose their function, and so then now they conceive of themselves as that. They don't, they're not conceiving of themselves as they did when they were 40 and they had all of these capacities and so on. So it's like in every moment of that continuum, for that moment we're freezing it, but then in the next moment, even when it changes, it doesn't, we can, it's like we can kind of just paper over that and like kind of ignore that, because it, I don't know, that kind of provides like a persistence of identity that we find easier or more comfortable, um, rather than that kind of groundlessness that I was talking about, just how this idea that um, there isn't that comfortable, reliable, owner, in the body and mind. It's almost like we do it because it provides a sense of comfort and a sense of agency or something that we feel like might be missing. But at the same time, it's what's trapping, it's what's preventing the arising of Buddhahood. It's what's preventing the mind from flourishing in these really incredible ways, being locked into just thinking of myself as really being this personality, this collection of thoughts and likes and dislikes, um, holding on to that and clinging to that is um, is not allowing the expansion of the mind into these exalted states of full enlightenment. And that's what we talked about in the previous classes. Buddha nature, in our from this perspective, is just the idea that the mind is transformable. The mind is empty of inherent existence. And so if we stop clinging to a limited, narrow perspective, and we embrace this wider perspective, and we embrace um, that sense of groundlessness, then we can flourish into that direction. We can move into an expanded sense, because the mind itself, what the things that the parts of the mind and body and that combination that we are grasping at, they are features, they are attributes, um, but that's not the whole story. There is a deeper level to the mind that exists independent from I like this, I don't like that, I think this is true, I don't think that's true. Um, I prefer that things be like this, and I prefer things not be like that. That's a very surface level of mind that we just generally don't go beyond, and we kind of think, well, that's really what I am, and that's all that I am, is this bunch of preferences and views, and a physical form that has certain qualities, like I'm tall or I'm short or I'm athletic or I'm sedentary or whatever it might be. um, and that kind of narrowing down of what's there, um, is cutting off that kind of potential growth, that kind of potential development. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can start to point out that things are flexible, things aren't so solid, things aren't so, it doesn't have to necessarily be just this kind of analysis. There are ways of um, thinking about that flexibility and just kind of reminding ourselves of that interdependence, that kind of more flexible way that we really do exist. Anything else? Oh, well, maybe it's like I said, it's dense material, so maybe we can leave it there for tonight, and we'll start uh, chapter 8 next week. All right, so at the beginning of our class, we set an altruistic motivation. So now we'll engage in what's called dedication, where we try to remove the ego from our spiritual practice. We try to cultivate a mind or a sense of giving away the idea of having accomplished anything for oneself, which is a way of really reinforcing emptiness in a way, and not letting our ego co-opt our practice. So we try to think that we listened and participated with that altruistic mind, and that created positive energy, and that positive energy will ripen reliably because cause and effect are dependable. Uh, Karma is empty of inherent existence, but cause and effect are still reliable. And so positive energy will ripen in positive ways. And so we just have a sense of offering that for the benefit of others, thinking when that positive energy ripens, may it ripen in whatever way is truly beneficial for sentient beings. So just on your own, have a sense of strongly visualizing that positive energy ripening in vast and profound beneficial ways that benefit sentient beings, countless sentient beings. Right. So we will pick it up again next Saturday.